Hi everyone, my name is Rajesh and in this video we are going to have a look at what is system testing when it comes to the ERP consulting training. In our last video, we have already seen what are the stages or the phases of any ERP consulting training, especially the functional training. In those stages, there were two crucial stages. The first was level 1 testing or the business process testing, and the second one was the scenario testing or the level 2 testing. Now, if you have not watched that video, then I'm giving the link of that over here so you can go back and check that out first and then come back to this particular video. Now, okay, we have seen what is scenario testing and what is business process testing, or what is level 1 testing and what is level 2 testing. But in first place, what is testing? And what are the certain tips that we need to make sure we follow during our initial ERP consulting functional training? That is exactly what we are going to find out in today's video. So let's begin. Now, before going into exploring the tips and tricks around the testing, let us first understand what is this business process testing and what is this scenario testing with a practical example. Now, just for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm taking the example of vendor invoice creation process in Oracle Cloud ERP for the financials domain. Now, if you are coming from any other domain than financials, or if you are, let's say, getting trained on any other ERP other than Oracle Cloud ERP, this video is as much applicable to you as it is for this domain and this ERP. So it is not around the software or it is not around the domain, but it is around the concept of what is involved in the basic testing of the business process and the basic testing of the scenario. So with that, let's begin the practical example. So I must have watched this video on how to create a vendor invoice in Oracle Cloud Payables, and I must have come to know about the basic navigation and stuff like that. So I will come to the system post watching this video or watching this session, and I will try to create the vendor invoice all by myself. So I will go to a certain menu called payable. I'll go to the invoice sub menu or the work area in it. I'll click on the task and I'll go to the create invoice form. Now I'll need to enter certain details. So let's say, let me enter one detail called business unit. Now we will see that later what exactly is this business unit and what all other fields meaning is. That's not the purpose. The purpose is just to create one vendor invoice as fast as possible and getting trained on, okay, if I am the end user and I need to create a vendor invoice in system, this is what, or this is how I will need to create it. So I'll need to enter the vendor invoice number. So as an end user, I must be having the copy of the invoice that I have got from this Dell INC as a supplier, and I will simply write that number. So let's say this is something like July 01 Dell 01, right? That's my invoice number. And I will have my total amount, including my taxes, appearing on the invoice, which I will be, by the way, entering over here in the header amount. I'll be changing currency if needed. I'll be changing the date of invoice if needed, changing the payment terms and so on and so forth. Then I will be entering the line amount, and then I will be entering the item or the distribution set, like what that invoice is for. So that is something that I need to enter in these fields. And then I will simply save the invoice. And there is one more step in completion of the invoice, which is the validation of the invoice. So I'll simply go and validate this particular invoice. So once the invoice is validated, at the time of validation, I know that from the session that system checks certain validations or system checks or control certain things, like whether all the things that are entered over here are correct or not. And then if everything is fine, then system turns the status of the invoice into validated, as you can see over here. Now this is my basic business process testing. Now the level 2, which is the scenario testing. Now, first of all, I need to figure out certain scenarios in my mind, and I need to see that, okay, if I'm creating the vendor invoice, then what all possibilities could be there. And those scenarios, as we have seen in our last video, we need to document in a proper testing log. So let me go to this documentation, and here I will need to enter, or I'll need to first of all think of what all different scenarios I might have for the vendor invoice creation, and I'll need to record those one by one. So let us quickly see a couple of examples over here. So let's say that my vendor invoice processing is the process that comes under the module accounts payable. So I'll write that module name. Then the process is vendor invoice creation. And then I will need to think of certain scenarios. So the first scenario I might get is, what if my invoice number is duplicate? So what if the supplier is sending me the same invoice twice and I'm simply recording that invoice and I end up paying twice to the supplier for the same invoice. So is the system going to stop me anywhere? Is the system going to show me it as a control violation or something? So for that, I will need to test this scenario, that what happens if I enter the duplicate invoice number. So I'll write down that scenario over here. So whether system allows to create duplicate invoice number for the same supplier. For the same supplier is what I need to test first of all. Now there could be another scenario where the supplier or the vendor is different, but the invoice number is same. That is very much possible logically, right, in business. And that is where I will need to test that also, like whether system allows to enter the duplicate invoice number if the supplier is different. So let me enter that also as a separate scenario. So let me enter the module name, the process name, and the scenario wherein I would say that for the different supplier. So what if whether the system allows to create the duplicate invoice number for the different supplier. And likewise, whatever scenarios come across my mind regarding the invoice processing or regarding the vendor invoice creation, I need to write down those scenarios. Next thing is I might need to allocate the priority to these scenarios. So how to allocate the priority? The basic thumb rule is going to be that, like, whatever I feel is the most common scenario in the business, those kind of scenarios I might have the priority 1. Otherwise, I might have the priority as 2 or 3. And then I will need to enter the status. As of now, both of these scenarios are pending, or I might write 10 or 15 different scenarios around the invoice processing. And I might write them all as pending at the moment or in the beginning. Now in the next stage, I will need to actually do the scenario testing. And that is where I will again go to the system. I will, let's say, save and close this particular transaction. And now I will try to enter the similar invoice or the invoice with the same invoice number. So this is the invoice that we had entered. So I'll just copy down this particular number and I will try to create one more invoice with the same number with the same detail. So over here, I will select the same business unit. I will select the same supplier, and then I will try to enter one more number or one more invoice with the same number and maybe same amount, or the amount can also be different. That can also be another business scenario, but let me not go into that right now. And once I enter this, then I will also enter the line level amount or line level detail, and then I will try to save this particular invoice. Now, as soon as I click on save button, the system has given me the error that this invoice number already exists. Enter a unique invoice number. And this is the error that I have got. So this scenario is now concluded that the system is not going to allow me to enter another invoice with the same number if the supplier and other details are same. So let me go back to my testing log and let me enter this particular conclusion over here. So I can see that, like, system does not allow to enter duplicate invoice number for the same supplier. It shows following error. And then I have copied the error text from the system, or it has not got copied. So let me copy that and simply enter that in my testing log. And if I want to have this for my reference, that what was that invoice number or what is something that I had tried to test, then I can simply mention that invoice number over here as my transaction reference from the system. If I also want to have the screenshot, I can just reproduce this error and then I can take the snapshot or the screenshot by using the tools such as snipping tools or maybe your print screen or any of such tools. And then I will simply give the reference to my screenshot file. Now I will need to be sure that where exactly this screenshot file is saved or stored. And that is how I keep on preparing my testing log. Now by this time, you must have got the knowledge around what is the business process testing and what is the scenario testing, how exactly you need to carry out the scenario testing with the proper documentation that is going to be referentiable for you in future. Now let us move ahead with certain tips and tricks around this testing exercise. So the first tip is that there are going to be a lot of dependencies when it comes to the testing of business processes or testing of scenarios. And you should be following the proper sequence or a proper guided learning path when it comes to the testing. You should not be jumping around multiple things, or you should not be trying to know all the things that are there on the screen while you are testing some process. For example, when I was entering this particular invoice, or when I was testing how to create a vendor invoice, I had some of the doubts on this particular screen. Let's assume as a beginner. So I might not know what is business unit. I might not know what is, let's say, the terms date, and so on and so forth. I might not know what is the distribution set over here. However, it is not needed to know all of these things in one go or in your first round of testing. That is not how the testing will work. It is a step by step process. So maybe in first go or in first attempt, you are just trying to find out how exactly the vendor invoice is created in the system. Or if you are somebody who is working in the accounts payable department of certain business, and if let's say the business is using Oracle Cloud ERP as the system, then as an accounts payable officer, how exactly you are going to enter this invoice into the system. That is the first step. The second step will then to figure out what is business unit, what is terms date, what is distribution set, and then let's say testing out all of these scenarios around duplicate invoice number when the vendor name is different, then let's say duplicate invoice number when the date is different, or maybe like invoice with 10 different lines, or maybe the invoice wherein the payment term involves something like I need to pay it in two installments. Then how to create such invoice? What if I'm creating an invoice in a foreign currency? So all of these are going to be the various test cases. Step by step, you are going to know multiple concepts around vendor invoice processing. So do not try to complete everything in one go. Tip number 2 is around the documentation. So I have just shown you how exactly you can document in a testing log in a Microsoft Excel as a tool. But the tip here is that you can either use, I personally recommend either of these two tools. One, either you use it in Microsoft Excel, or you use the Microsoft OneNote as the tool for maintaining your documentation. Why only these two tools? Because it becomes organized. Your documentation becomes organized if you are using any of these two tools. And second and most important thing is, suppose that 2 years down the line you want to figure out or find out something what you remember vaguely that you had entered in your testing log. Now, if these documentations or testing logs are maintained in some Excel file or OneNote, it becomes easy to go and find out what you had entered in that log. On the other hand, if you are maintaining your testing documentation on a piece of paper, which is a physical copy, then there is no chance you can make it referentiable or you can use it as effectively as you could use the Excel or OneNote documentation. So that is the second tip. Always maintain your test log documentation in Microsoft Excel or OneNote. The third tip is again around the documentation. Many a times the trainees to whom I train on Oracle Cloud ERP, they come to me and ask like how exactly we should make the documentation, or let's say we have made the documentation in this specific manner. So is it right or is it wrong? Now, let me tell you that there is nothing right or wrong in a specific fashion of maintaining documentation. The only objective with which you should be maintaining the documentation or the testing log is how referentiable it is. So if 2 years, 3 years down the line, you are doing some project and you are stuck in some particular testing scenario, wherein you vaguely remember that during my initial training, I had done this testing, but I don't recall what was the conclusion or what was the reference, how exactly I had done that. So make sure that within 1 minute's time, you should be able to locate in your documentation where exactly you had maintained that particular testing log and what was your conclusion, and it should serve that purpose. That should be the only sole objective of maintaining documentation. Otherwise, any specific way or fashion of maintaining documentation is absolutely fine. Just remember these two things around the documentation. First, make it soft copy, better make it in Excel or OneNote, and second, make it referentiable. Okay, now the tip number 4. Do not mix any two testing scenarios while you are doing the testing on system. Now, what do I mean by that? Again, taking the example of my invoice processing test case. Now here, while I'm entering the invoice, I might get something in my mind that, okay, what if my invoice is that of future date? Then whether system will allow me to enter, and I try to combine it in the same test case. Like here in this particular test case, I was testing whether the duplicate invoice numbering is allowed or not. Now let me also include in this test case itself that if I enter the date of invoice is 1st of August, then whether system is going to allow me to do that. Now this particular thing might be risky. Like if you are combining more than one testing scenarios into the one single test case, it might sometimes give you the false conclusion. And that is where it is never recommended to mix two different scenarios into a same test case. Better make it a different test case for each individual scenario. And many a times it will happen that by the time or when you are doing this testing for one scenario, another scenario comes across in your mind. Now what you will need to do in that case is you need to come back to your testing log, and whatever thought process that you had got or whatever scenario that you had thought of, you just need to record it as a separate scenario. Like in this case, I might come back here and I might record that, okay, what if my invoice date is in future? So whether system is going to allow me or not, and let me record that as a separate scenario altogether. So again, here I might give the priority to, because I know that in business that's not going to be a very common scenario where I am entering the invoice that bears some future date or that has got some future date. And that is where it is okay even if I keep this as a priority to testing. And that's where, or that's how you need to make sure that you are not mixing two scenarios and you are keeping every test round confined to an individual scenario. Our testing tip number 5 is never do the testing in isolation. It means you should always try to cross check your conclusions or cross check your findings with some of your colleagues, some of your teammates or batchmates. Why it is important? Because while you are still in the initial phase of the ERP consulting training, you might not know how certain setups and configurations are affecting your testing. And because of those kind of differences in configurations or setup, the conclusions might differ. So do not stick to any certain conclusion that yes, if I have tested this and if system has shown me this kind of result, then exactly this is how it is going to be. Don't do that. Don't cement your conclusions. Don't stick to your conclusions. First of all, cross check with others, like whether others are getting the same conclusion for the similar test case. And if their conclusions are contradictory, then try to find out the reasons, like why the system is behaving in two different ways for two of you, right? So you might get something new, or you might get to learn some other setup or configuration or some other point why it is happening the way it is happening. And that is how you need to do the testing, not in isolation, but as a part of a team. Testing tip number 6, as we have already seen a couple of moments back, that while testing, if you have come to any other scenario or if you stumble upon any other thought that what if this happens, what if that happens in this particular test case, then do not divert or do not get diverted from what you are testing right now. Rather, just go back to your test log, maintain or record that scenario or thought that has come to your mind as a separate test case. Come back to your current test case, conclude that first, and then go to the next scenario, or then go to the next test case, what you have recorded in your testing log. This is something that is very necessary to do your testing in organized and time bound manner. Otherwise, many a times what happens is like you embark on a journey to test some specific feature in a particular process, and then half an hour down the line you come to know or you figure out that you have ended up testing something else altogether, and what you had started with is still untested or is still something that you have not concluded, and that ideally reduces your testing efficiency or the time management. That is where it is very important to do the testing in a structured or organized manner, to conclude first testing first and then go to the next testing. The final and last tip is, do not conclude anything or do not be rigid in terms of your conclusions, at least in the initial phase of testing. You might have cross-checked your conclusions with your batchmates or colleagues, and it may be the case that all of you are getting same sort of conclusion. But you still need to make sure that you are all in the initial learning phase of the ERP training. And that is where sometimes you all might not know some different feature or some different configuration of the system that makes the system behave the other way in your similar test case. And that is where, even if you are getting the same conclusion, still do not conclude that, or do not, let's say, be rigid that okay, in this test scenario this is exactly how the conclusion is going to be, and if somebody is receiving some other conclusion, then he or she must be completely wrong. Do not do it that way. Be flexible or be open that the conclusion what we have drawn is fine. We can write down that conclusion or observation at the moment, but it might still be the case that we have not completely understood this, and the conclusion might change going ahead after we come to know certain more configuration steps or setups or points. So that is something that you need to remember while doing testing in the initial phase of ERP consulting training. I hope with this practical demonstration of what is business process testing and what is scenario testing, plus with these tips and tricks around the testing, you must have got enough insight that will help you sell through this ERP consulting initial training phase effectively. Thank you everyone for watching this video. Recently, on our portal www.yourerpcoach.com, we have launched the login and first free course. So, if you are interested and if you want to build your career as a finance functional consultant in Oracle Cloud ERP, the course with which we are beginning our journey at yourerpcoach.com, then please visit our site yourerpcoach.com, log in, register yourself, and watch our first free course on basics of ERP. Once you complete this particular course and once you have completed your profile on our portal, we will be contacting you for the further process, shortlisting, personal interview, aptitude test, and so on, in order to admit you in our flagship course, which is Oracle Cloud Financials Complete Course. So if you want to build a rewarding career for yourself as an ERP consultant, go visit www.yourerpcoach.com right now.